Russia still worships the image of the hard man, the soldier, the miner, the factory foreman. Strong, silent, dependable. The one holding the country together with his hands. That is the image. The reality is much stranger. If you look at today's Russia, more and more of those traditional men are simply missing. Some were sent to the front and killed, some came back broken, some fled, and many were never really replaced at all. So here's the question. If the macho empire is running short of men, who is actually keeping it alive now? Russia still talks like a male state, but more and more it is being held together by the very people the regime treats as secondary, temporary, or disposable. I'm Elvira Bary, a writer born in the Soviet Union, and today I want to show you what happens when an empire built on masculine myth starts running out of male bodies and has to improvise its way through the shortage. Here's our roadmap. The masculine myth breaks. How Russia lost the human reserve it once took for granted. Women take the wheel. Why the state suddenly needs women for jobs it long called unsuitable. Grandmothers don't retire. How labor shortages turn old age into another reserve. The empire needs outsiders. How nationalism collides with the need for migrant labor. The North Korean future. What it means when authoritarian state starts hunting for bodies anywhere it can. No way out. Why Russia can't innovate its way out of a human shortage it spent decades creating. If you value independent analysis, subscribe, like, and share. You can also join my think tank, support through PayPal or Super Thanks, or tap hype points. And if you are listening on Spotify, hit follow so the next episode lands in your feed automatically. The masculine myth breaks. For centuries, Russia could compensate for bad institutions with sheer numbers. Its economy and technology often lagged, and yet it had a powerful advantage. An enormous supply of obedient male bodies to throw into armies, mines, forests, construction sites, and state projects. Enough men to keep the machine moving despite the losses. That human reserve helped Russia resist richer and more advanced rivals again and again. Now that resources running out. This began much earlier than Putin's war. The two world wars and decades of Stalin's terror burned through more than one generation. The total loss of life is hard to estimate, but it is firmly in 8 figures. After World War II, Russia's fertility rate dropped sharply. From the mid-1960s, it stayed close to 2.0. That was the second demographic transition that came earlier than in the US or France. A rural family with 5 kids gave place to an urban family that only had 1 or 2. Later, the post-Soviet collapse added another blow. In the 1990s, births went down by half, from 2.5 to 1.2 million children per year. This smaller generation is now aged between mid-20s and mid-30s. The Kremlin is leaning on them as a draft pool and young families who make more babies. But there are simply not enough people to rise up to the challenge. The cohort is about half the size of the past one, born in the 1980s. Today, Russia's population is shrinking and aging, while births remain at the lowest levels seen in decades. In the first half of 2024, about 600,000 children were born, the lowest figure in 25 years. After that, the government ceased the publication of monthly demographic data. By 2025, the numbers had become so bleak that demographer Alexei Raksha Single out February 2025 when Eurostat reported just 90,500 births, the lowest monthly figure since the early 1800s. So when people say Russia can always throw more men into the war, they are partly living in an old myth. Yes, the regime still finds men. It scrapes them from poor regions, broken towns, prisons, ethnic republics, and damaged families. It grabs the man with the fewest options and the weakest bargaining power. But those men were not useless leftovers. They were also drivers, welders, guards, loaders, mechanics, and shift workers. They were part of the civilian economy. Remove enough of them and the state loses those who kept this economy running. Today, Russia faces an immediate shortage of at least 2.3 million workers. Labor shortages spreading across the economy, worsened by defense sector hiring and migrant restrictions. Unemployment is down to 2.3%, which sounds healthy only if you ignore the reason. In Russia's case, it means the labor pool is stretched so tight the state is scavenging for bodies. And Putin is not planning to stop. Ukraine has already learned that drones can grind through vast amounts of cannon fodder. That means the old Russian logic, throw enough bodies on the enemy and eventually you win, has become obsolete. But the Kremlin still thinks in that old language because it does not really know another one. It still imagines that quantity can cover for stupidity. But that quantity is no longer what it was. The macho empire is discovering that its favorite raw material has become scarce. Women take the wheel. When an authoritarian system runs short of men, it turns toward women, not to empower them, to use them the way it used men. That is what is happening in Russia now. For decades, the state treated women as unsuitable for a long list of dangerous or physically demanding jobs. Then reality intervened. In 2021, Russia shortened its list of banned professions for women, allowing them to become metro drivers, train conductors, and lorry drivers. The old list has been cut to 100 restricted professions from a much larger Soviet-era roster. In other words, the state admitted that work it had long called too difficult or improper for women was suddenly acceptable. After all, this is not a feminist revolution, but an emergency patch. The woman the system treated as biologically unsuited yesterday is now good enough to operate heavy machinery, haul cargo, or run public transport because there are not enough men left who are available, sober, alive, nearby, and willing to do it. And this matters because Russia's official culture is still extremely gendered. The Kremlin sells a world of real men and real women. Men are fighters, builders, and protectors. Women are mothers, caretakers, and housekeepers, but behind that image, the state is being forced to move in the opposite direction. And here's the deeper irony. Women have always carried far more of Russia than the macho myth admits. They held together schools, clinics, offices, local survival, and often family budgets as well. Now the state is forced to lean on them even harder in sectors it once coded as male. That is how demographics humiliates ideology. Grandmothers don't retire. A healthy society lets old people slow down. A strained society starts looking at them as reserve labor. Russia is aging fast, and the war has made the labor shortage worse. So the state is being pushed toward a very ugly conclusion. It cannot afford rest. Let's start with the scale. At the start of 2025, Russia had a little over 41 million pension recipients. That is an enormous mass of people living on pensions, almost 30% of the population. Russia had already raised the retirement age before the full-scale invasion. That was one of the clearest signs that the old demographic model was failing. The post-Soviet labor pool was shrinking. Life expectancy had improved just enough to create pressure on the pension system, and the state wanted people to keep working longer. Now, imagine what this looks like outside Moscow. Russia is a country of aging towns, thinning regions, and collapsing local birth rates. The center still pretends to be modern. The periphery looks older every year. Younger people leave if they can. Men disappear into the military, defense industry, or cemeteries. The result is a strange landscape. Schools with fewer children, villages with more funerals than births, and workplaces held together by people who should have been allowed to retire years ago. Between 8 and 9 million of Russians in their 60s and 70s are still working, and most of them are women. This is why I want the title of this section to sound a little cruel, because the reality is cruel. Grandmothers don't retire, not because they are full of joyful Soviet stamina, not because work gives them such thrilling purpose, but because the state needs them. The pension is often too small, families are stretched, and there may be no one else left to keep a clinic desk staffed, a school office running, or a municipal service alive. You can see the same logic in countries across Europe and East Asia where aging societies keep people in their workforce longer. But Russia's version is harsher because it is happening inside a war economy that keeps removing working-age men while demanding more labor everywhere else. The empire needs outsiders. Russian nationalism tells one story. The labor market tells another. The nationalist story says Russia should belong to ethnic Russians who fully fit the cultural script. The economy says, that is nice, but who is going to pour the concrete, clean the streets, carry the boxes, and lay the bricks? For years, Russia solved this contradiction quietly. It pulled in cheap labor from Central Asia. Men from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan came to do the work many Russians didn't want, especially in construction, delivery, housing services, cleaning, logistics, and low-prestige urban labor. Everyone understood this, even if they pretended not to. The empire needed outsiders. Then the contradiction got sharper. The war pulled Russian men into the army and defense sector. Immigration removed more workers. At the same time, xenophobic rhetoric intensified, especially after the Crocus City Hall attack in 2024, when hostility toward Central Asian migrants rose sharply. Politicians and regional bosses started competing in macho posturing. They promised jobs for locals to flatter ethnic anxiety. And then reality punched back. Severstal, one of Russia's biggest steel makers, warned a regional ban on migrant labor in construction would damage major industrial and social projects. A week later, the Vologda region governor rolled back his migrant labor ban after corporate outcry. The official excuse for the ban had been concern for local employment. But once they actually looked at the numbers, there were simply not enough working-age Russians to fill the jobs. Today, Russia is pivoting to India for labor because Central Asian flows are no longer enough and have become politically more difficult. This is where authoritarian logic starts to look pathetic. A regime that boasts of strength has to keep importing the workers it teaches people to fear. A state that talks endlessly about masculine national revival cannot keep its own labor market alive without outsiders. And once that gap grows too wide, social tension becomes inevitable. I have a dedicated video about the unobvious threat that migrant labor poses to Russia's stability. The North Korean future. When a labor-starved authoritarian state starts running out of normal options, it becomes inevitable in darker ways. North Korean labor in Russia is another warning sign. In 2025, North Korea sent thousands of military construction workers and sappers to Russia's Kursk region after North Korean troops had already fought there alongside Russian forces. The fact that Russia accepts and welcomes this kind of aid tells us something important. That is the behavior of a state whose shortages are becoming strategic and whose political instincts are so rapt that it would rather reach for controlled, coerced, highly dependent foreign labor than rethink the system that creates the shortage in the first place. North Korean workers do not come with bargaining power. They come from one of the most tightly controlled societies on earth, through a relationship between two regimes that already trade in weapons and soldiers. And once you see that clearly, the logic becomes obvious. The macho empire has run short of men. It has stretched women harder. It is leaning on pensioners. It still needs migrants while teaching society to resent them. And when even that is not enough, it begins to reach for labor that is even more dependent, even easier to control, and even less able to resist. No way out. The last illusion I want to break is the smartest one. People in the West often imagine that Russia must still have some hidden reserve of brilliant engineers, scientists, and problem solvers like those who were behind the Soviet breakthrough in space. Some deep bench of minds that will eventually step forward, reorganize the economy, master the technology gap, and save the system at the last minute. That fantasy is wrong. Russia does still have talented people. Of course it does. A country that large cannot help producing them, but that is not the same as having a healthy reserve of human capital ready to rescue a decaying state. The longer story points the other way, a shrinking research base and chronic brain drain. At the end of the Soviet period, Russia had almost 1 million researchers, but only about 340,000 by 2021. That is close to a threefold drop, and the war compounds that process. Isolation from Western institutions cuts Russian researchers off from collaboration, equipment, conferences, and career paths. In 2024, CERN ended cooperation agreements covering around 500 scientists linked to Russian institutes. That's one example of how the country's scientific community is being narrowed, isolated, and made less attractive to ambitious younger people. This is why there's no real reserve, because a healthy reserve is not just raw intelligence. It is institutions that cultivate talent, reward competence, connect people to global networks, and allow independent initiative to matter. Putin's system does the opposite. It punishes autonomy, narrows horizons, and teaches the smartest people that their best career move may be immigration, silence, or work that serves the state's short-term needs instead of country's long-term future. So the final picture is bleak but clear. That is a system running on fumes. Before you go, I want to ask you something specific. In your own country or community, what's one job or role that quietly changed hands because the usual people stopped being available? Who stepped in? Women, retirees, migrants, outsiders, someone else? And what did that change reveal about the system underneath? If this video helped you see that pattern more clearly, please like the video and subscribe. Share it with one person who still thinks Russia has endless reserves of strength. And if you want to support this work directly, you can join my think tank or use PayPal or SuperThanks. You can also tap high points to help this episode travel further. And if you're listening on Spotify, hit follow so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for watching. See you next time.